The Tower of the Elephant by Robert Irvin Howard. Chapter 2. The lurid lights and drunken revelry fell away behind the Cimmerian. He had discarded his torn tunic, and walked through the night naked except for a loincloth and his high-strapped sandals. He moved with the supple ease of a great tiger, his steely muscles rippling under his brown skin. He had entered the part of the city reserved for the temples. On all sides of him they glittered white in the starlight, snowy marble pillars and golden domes and silver arches, shrines of Zamora's myriad strange gods. He did not trouble his head about them. He knew that Zamora's religion, like all things of a civilized, long-setted people, was intricate and complex, and had lost most of the pristine essence in a maze of formulas and rituals. He had squatted for hours in the courtyards of the philosophers, listening to the arguments of theologians and teachers, and come away in a haze of bewilderment, sure of only one thing, and that they were all touched in the head. His gods were simple and understandable. Crom was their chief, and he lived on a great mountain, whence he sent forth dooms and death. It was useless to call on Crom, because he was a gloomy, savage god, and he hated weaklings. But he gave a man courage at birth, and the will and might to kill his enemies, which, in the Cimmerian's mind, was all any god should be expected to do. His sandaled feet made no sound on the gleaming pave. No watchman passed, for even the thieves of the mall shunned the temples, where strange dooms had been known to fall on violators. Ahead of him he saw, looming against the sky, the Tower of the Elephant. He mused, wondering why it was so named. No one seemed to know. He had never seen an elephant, but he vaguely understood that it was a monstrous animal, with a tail in front as well as behind. This a wandering Shemite had told him, swearing that he had seen such beasts by the thousands in the country of the Hyrcanians, but all men knew what liars were the men of Shem. At any rate, there were no elephants in Zamora. The shimmering shaft of the tower rose frostily in the stars. In the sunlight, it shone so dazzlingly that few could bear its glare, and men said that it was built of silver. It was round, a slim, perfect cylinder, 150 feet in height, and its rim glittered in the starlight with the great jewels which crusted it. The tower stood among the waving, exotic trees of a garden raised high above the general level of the city. A high wall enclosed this garden, and outside the wall was a lower level, likewise enclosed by a wall. No lights shone forth. There seemed to be no windows in the tower, at least not above the level of the inner wall. Only the gems high above sparkled frostily in the starlight. Shrubbery grew thick outside the lower or outer wall. The Cimmerian crept close and stood beside the barrier, measuring it with his eye. It was high, but he could leap and catch the coping with his fingers. Then it would be a child's play to swing himself up and over, and he did not doubt that he could pass the inner wall in the same manner. But he hesitated at the thought of the strange perils which were said to await within. These people were strange and mysterious to him. They were not of his kind, not even of the same blood as the more westerly Brythunians, Nemedians, Kothians, and Aquilonians, whose civilized mysteries had awed him in times past. The people of Zamora were very ancient, and, from what he had seen of them, very evil. He thought of Yara, the high priest, who worked strange dooms from this jeweled tower, and the Cimmerian's hair prickled as he remembered a tale told by a drunken page of the court, how Yara had laughed in the face of a hostile prince and held up a glowing evil gem before him, and how rays shot blindingly from that unholy jewel to envelop the prince, who screamed and fell down and shrank to a withered, blackened lump that changed to a black spider which scampered wildly about the chamber until Yara set his heel upon it. Yara came not often from his tower of magic, and always to work evil on some man or some nation. The king of Zamora feared him more than he feared death, and kept himself drunk all the time, because that fear was more than he could bear sober. Yara was very old, centuries old, men said, and added that he would live forever because of the magic of his gem, which men called the Heart of the Elephant, for no better reason than they named his hold the Elephant's Tower. The Cimmerian, engrossed in these thoughts, shrank quickly against the wall. Within the garden someone was passing, who walked with a measured stride. The listener heard the clink of steel, so after all, a guard did pace those gardens. The Cimmerian waited, expecting to hear him pass again on the next round, but silence rested over the mysterious gardens. At last, curiosity overcame him. Leaping lightly, he grasped the wall and swung himself to the top with one arm. Lying flat on the broad coping, he looked down into the wide space between the walls. No shrubbery grew near him, though he saw some carefully trimmed bushes near the inner wall. The starlight fell on the even sward, and somewhere a fountain tinkled. The Cimmerian cautiously lowered himself down on the inside and drew his sword, staring about him. He was shaken by the nervousness of the wild at standing thus unprotected in the naked starlight, and he moved lightly around the curve of the wall, hugging its shadow, until he was even with the shrubbery he had noticed. Then he ran quickly toward it, crouching low, and almost tripped over a form that lay crumpled near the edges of the bushes. A quick look to right and left showed him no enemy, in sight at least, and he bent close to investigate. His keen eyes, even in the dim starlight, showed him a strongly built man in the silvered armor and crested helm of the Cimmerian Royal Guard. A shield and a spear lay near him, and it took but an instant's examination to show that he had been strangled. The barbarian glanced about uneasily. He knew that this man must be the guard he had heard pass his hiding place by the wall. Only a short time had passed, yet in that interval nameless hand had reached out of the dark and choked out the soldier's life. Straining his eyes in the gloom, he saw a hint of motion through the shrubs near the wall. Thither he glided, gripping his sword. He made no more noise than a panther stealing through the night, yet the man he was stalking heard. The Cimmerian had a dim glimpse of a huge bulk close to the wall, felt relief that it was at least human. Then the fellow wheeled quickly with a gasp that sounded like panic, made the first motion of a forward plunge, hands clutching, then recoiled as the Cimmerian's blade caught the starlight. For a tense instant neither spoke, standing ready for anything. "You're no soldier," hissed the stranger at last. "You're a thief like myself." "And who are you?" asked the Cimmerian in a suspicious whisper. "Taurus of Nemedia." The Cimmerian lowered his sword. "I've heard of you. Men call you a prince of thieves." A low laugh answered him. Taurus was tall as the Cimmerian, and heavier. He was big-bellied and fat, but his every movement betokened a subtle dynamic magnetism, which was reflected in the keen eyes that glinted vitally, even in the starlight. He was bare-footed, and carried a coil of what looked like a thin, strong rope, knotted at regular intervals. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Conan, a Cimmerian," answered the other. "I came seeking a way to steal Yara's jewel, that men call the Elephant's Heart." Conan sensed the man's great belly shaking in laughter, but it was not derisive. "By Bel, god of thieves," hissed Taurus. "I had thought only myself had courage to attempt that poaching. These Cimmerians call themselves thieves. Bah! Conan, I like your grit. I never shared an adventure with anyone, but by Bel, we'll attempt this together, if you're willing." "Then you're after the gem too?" "What else? I've had plans laid for months, but you, I think, have acted on sudden impulse, my friend." "You killed the soldier?" "Of course. I slid over the wall when he was on the other side of the garden. I hid in the bushes. He heard me, or thought he heard something. When he came blundering over, it was no trick at all to get behind him and suddenly grip his neck and choke out his fool's life. He was like most men, half blind in the dark. A good thief should have eyes like a cat." "You made one mistake," said Conan. Taurus's eyes flashed angrily. "A mistake? Impossible." "You should have dragged the body into the bushes." Said the novice to the master of the art, "They will not change the guard until past midnight. Should any come searching for him now and find his body, they would flee at once to Yara, bellowing the news, and give us time to escape. Were they not to find it, they'd go beating up the bushes and catch us like rats in a trap." "You're right," agreed Conan. "So, now attend. We waste time in this cursed discussion. There are no guards in the inner garden, human guards, I mean, though there are sentinels even more deadly. It was their presence which baffled me for so long, but I finally discovered a way to circumvent them." "What of the soldiers in the lower part of the tower?" "Old Yara dwells in the chambers above. By that route we will come, and go, I hope. Never mind asking me how. I have arranged a way. We'll steal down through the top of the tower and strangle old Yara before he can cast any of his accursed spells on us. At least, we'll try. It's the chance of being turned into a spider or a toad against the wealth and power of the world. All good thieves must know how to take risks." "I'll go as far as any man," said Conan, slipping off his sandals. "Then follow me." And turning, Taurus leaped up, caught the wall, and drew himself up. The man's suppleness was amazing, considering his bulk. He seemed almost to glide up over the edge of the coping. Conan followed him, and lying flat on the broad top, they spoke in wary whispers. "I see no light," Conan muttered. The lower part of the tower seemed much like that portion visible from outside the garden, a perfect, gleaming cylinder with no apparent openings. "There are cleverly constructed doors and windows," answered Taurus, "but they are closed. The soldiers breathe air that comes from above." The garden was a vague pool of shadows, where feathery bushes and low-spreading trees waved darkly in the starlight. Conan's wary soul felt the aura of waiting menace that brooded over it. He felt the burning glare of unseen eyes, and he caught a subtle sense that made the short hairs on his neck instinctively bristle, as a hunting dog bristles at the scent of an ancient enemy. "Follow me," whispered Taurus. "Keep behind me as you value your life." Taking what looked like a copper tube from his girdle, the Nemedian dropped lightly to the sward near the wall. Conan was close behind him, sword ready, but Taurus pushed him back, close to the wall, and showed no inclination to advance himself. His whole attitude was of tense expectancy, and his gaze, like Conan's, was fixed upon the shadowy mass of shrubbery a few yards away. This shrubbery was shaken, although the breeze had died down. Then, two great eyes blazed from the waving shadows, and behind them other sparks of fire glinted in the darkness. "Lions," muttered Conan. "Aye, by day they are kept in subterranean caves below the tower. That's why there are no guards in this garden." Conan counted the eyes rapidly. 5 in sight, maybe more back in the bushes. They'll charge in a moment." "Be silent," hissed Taurus, and he moved from the wall, cautiously, as if treading on razors, lifting the slender tube. Low rumblings rose from the shadows, and the blazing eyes moved forward. Conan could sense the great slavering jaws and tufted tails lashing tawny sides. The air grew tense. The Cimmerian gripped his sword, expecting the charge and the irresistible hurtling of giant bodies. Then Taurus brought the mouth of the tube to his lips and blew powerfully. A long jet of yellowish powder shot from the other end of the tube and billowed out instantly in a thick, green-yellow cloud that settled over the shrubbery, blotting out the glaring eyes. Taurus ran back hastily to the wall. Conan glared without understanding. The thick cloud hid the shrubbery, and from it no sound came. "What is that mist?" the Cimmerian asked uneasily. "Death," hissed the Nemedian. "If a wind springs up and blows it back upon us, we must flee over the wall. But no, the wind is still, and now it is dissipating. Wait until it vanishes entirely. To breathe it is death. Presently, only yellowish shreds hung ghostly in the air. Then they were gone, and Taurus motioned his companion forward. They stole towards the bushes, and Conan gasped. Stretched out in the shadows lay 5 great tawny shapes, the fire of their grim eyes dimmed forever. A sweetish, cloying scent lingered in the atmosphere. "They died without a sound," muttered the Cimmerian. "Taurus, what was that powder?" "It was made from the black lotus, whose blossoms wave in the lost jungles of Kitai, where only the yellow-skulled priests of Yun dwell. Those blossoms strike dead any who smell of them." Conan knelt beside the great forms, assuring himself that they were indeed beyond power of harm. He shook his head. The magic of the exotic lands was mysterious and terrible to the barbarians of the north. "Why can you not slay the soldiers in the tower in the same way?" he asked. "Because that's all the powder I possess. The obtaining of it was a feat which in itself was enough to make me famous among the thieves of the world. I stole it out of a caravan bound for Stygia, and I lifted it, in its cloth of gold bag, out of the coils of the great serpent which guarded it, without awakening him. But come, in Bel's name, are we to waste the night in discussion?" They glided through the shrubbery to the gleaming foot of the tower, and there, with a motion enjoining silence, Taurus unwound his knotted cord, on one end of which was a strong steel hook. Conan saw his plan, and asked no questions as the Nemedian gripped the line a short distance below the hook, and began to swing it about his head. Conan laid his ear to the smooth wall and listened, but could hear nothing. Evidently the soldiers within did not suspect the presence of the intruders, who had made no more sound than the night wind blowing through the trees. But a strange nervousness was on the barbarian. Perhaps it was the lion smell, which was over everything. Taurus threw the line with a smooth, ripping motion of his mighty arm. The hook curved upward and inward in a peculiar manner, hard to describe, and vanished over the jeweled rim. It apparently caught firmly, for cautious jerking and then hard pulling did not result in any slipping or giving. "Luck the first cast," murmured Taurus. It was Conan's savage instinct which made him wheel suddenly, for the death that was upon them made no sound. A fleeting glimpse showed the Cimmerian the giant tawny shape, rearing upright against the stars, towering over him for the death stroke. No civilized man could have moved half so quickly as the barbarian moved. His sword flashed frostily in the starlight, with every ounce of desperate nerve and thew behind it, and the man and beast went down together. Cursing incoherently beneath his breath, Taurus bent over the mass and saw his companion's limbs move as he strove to drag himself from under the great weight that lay limply upon him. A glance showed the startled Nemedian that the lion was dead, its slanting skull split in half. He laid hold of the carcass, and by his aid Conan thrust it aside and clambered up, still gripping his dripping sword. "Are you hurt, man?" gasped Taurus, still bewildered by the stunning swiftness of that touch-and-go episode. "No, by Crom," answered the barbarian. "But that was as close a call as I've had in a life no ways tame. Why did not the cursed beast roar as he charged?" "All things are strange in this garden," said Taurus. "The lions strike silently, and so do other deaths. But come, little sound was made in that slaying, but the soldiers might have heard, if they are not asleep or drunk. That beast was in some other part of the garden and escaped the death of the flowers, but surely there are no more. We must climb this cord. Little need to ask a Cimmerian if he can." "If it will bear my weight," grunted Conan, cleansing his sword on the grass. "It will bear thrice my own," answered Taurus. "It was woven from the tresses of dead women, which I took from their tombs at midnight and steeped in the deadly wine of the upas tree, to give it strength. I will go first, then follow me closely." The Nemedian gripped the rope and, crooking a knee about it, began the ascent. He went up like a cat, belying the apparent clumsiness of his bulk. The Cimmerian followed. The cord swayed and turned on itself, but the climbers were not hindered. Both had made more difficult climbs before. The jeweled rim glittered high above them, jutting out from the perpendicular of the wall. so the cord hung perhaps a foot from the side of the tower, a fact which added greatly to the ease of the ascent. Up and up they went, silently, the lights of the city spreading out further and further to their sight as they climbed, the stars above them more and more dimmed by the glitter of jewels along the rim. Now Taurus reached up a hand and gripped the rim itself, pulling himself up and over. Conan paused a moment on the very edge, fascinated by the great frosty jewels whose gleams dazzled his eyes. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, turquoises, moonstones, set thick as stars in a shimmering silver. At a distance, their different gleams had seemed to merge into a pulsing white glare, but now, at close range, they shimmered with a million rainbow tints and lights, hypnotizing him with their scintillations. "There is a fabulous fortune here, Taurus," he whispered, but the Nemedian answered impatiently, "Come on. If we secure the heart, these and all other things shall be ours." Conan climbed over the sparkling rim. The level of the tower's top was some feet below the gemmed ledge. It was flat, composed of some dark blue substance, set with gold that caught the starlight, so the whole looked like a wide sapphire flecked with shining gold dust. Across from the point where they had entered, there seemed to be a sort of chamber built upon the roof. It was of the same silvery material as the walls of the tower, adorned with designs worked in smaller gems. Its single door was of gold, its surface cut in scales, encrusted with jewels that gleamed like ice. Conan cast a glance at the pulsing ocean of lights which spread far below them, then glanced at Taurus. The Nemedian was drawing up his cord and coiling it. He showed Conan where the hook had caught. A fraction of an inch of the point had sunk under a great blazing jewel on the inner side of the rim. "Luck was with us again," he muttered. "One would think that our combined weight would have torn that stone out. Follow me. The real risks of this venture begin now. We are in the serpent's lair, and we know not where he lies hidden." Like stalking tigers, they crept across the darkly gleaming floor and halted outside the sparkling door. With a deft and cautious hand, Taurus tried it. It gave without resistance, and the companions looked in, tensed for anything. Over the Nemedian's shoulder, Conan had a glimpse of a glittering chamber, the walls, the ceiling, and floor of which were crusted with great white jewels which lighted it brightly, and which seemed its only illumination. It seemed empty of life. "Before we cut off our last retreat," hissed Taurus, "go you to the rim and look over on all sides. If you see any soldiers moving in the gardens, or anything suspicious, return and tell me. I will await you within this chamber." Conan saw scant reason in this, and a faint suspicion of his companion touched his wary soul, but he did as Taurus requested. As he turned away, the Nemedian slipped inside the door and drew it shut behind him. Conan crept about the rim of the tower, returning to his starting point without having seen any suspicious movement in the vaguely waving sea of leaves below. He turned towards the door. Suddenly, from within the chamber, there sounded a strangled cry. The Cimmerian leaped forward, electrified. The gleaming door swung open, and Taurus stood framed in the cold blaze behind him. He swayed, and his lips parted, but only a dry rattle burst from his throat. Catching at the golden door for support, he lurched out onto the roof, then fell headlong, clutching at his throat. The door swung to behind him. Conan, crouching like a panther at bay, saw nothing in the room behind the stricken Nemedian in the brief instant that the door was partly open, unless it was not a trick of the light which made it seem as if a shadow darted across the gleaming floor. Nothing followed Taurus out on the roof, and Conan bent above the man. The Nemedian stared up with dilated, glazing eyes that somehow held a terrible bewilderment. His hands clawed at his throat. His lips slobbered and gurgled. Then suddenly he stiffened, and the astounded Cimmerian knew that he was dead. And he felt that Taurus had died without knowing what manner of death had stricken him. Conan glared bewilderingly at the cryptic golden door. In that empty room, with its glittering jeweled walls, death had come to the Prince of Thieves as swiftly and mysteriously as he had dealt doom to the lions in the garden below. Gingerly, the barbarian ran his hands over the man's half-naked body, seeking a wound. But the only marks of violence were between his shoulders, high up near the base of his bull neck. 3 small wounds, which looked as if 3 nails had been driven deep into the flesh and withdrawn. The edges of these wounds were black, and a faint smell as of putrefaction was evident. Poisoned darts? Thought Conan. But in that case, the missiles should still be in the wounds. Cautiously, he stole towards the golden door, pushed it open, and looked inside. The chamber lay empty, bathed in the cold, pulsing glow of the myriad jewels. In the very center of the ceiling, he idly noted a curious design, a black, 8-sided pattern, in the center of which 4 gems glittered with a red flame, unlike the white blaze of the other jewels. Across the room there was another door, like the one in which he stood, except that it was not carved in the scale pattern. Was it from that door that death had come? And having struck down his victim, had it retreated by the same way? Closing the door behind him, the Cimmerian advanced into the chamber. His bare feet made no sound on the crystal floor. There were no chairs or tables in the chamber, only 3 or 4 silken couches, embroidered with gold and worked in strange serpentine designs, and several silver-bound mahogany chests. Some were sealed with heavy golden locks, others lay open, their carven lids thrown back, revealing heaps of jewels and a careless riotous splendor to the Cimmerian's astounded eyes. Conan swore beneath his breath. Already he had looked upon more wealth that night than he had ever dreamed existed in all the world, and he grew dizzy thinking of what must be the value of the jewel he sought. He was in the center of the room now, going stooped forward, head thrust out warily, sword advanced, when again death struck at him soundlessly. A flying shadow that swept across the gleaming floor was his only warning, and his instinctive sidelong leap all that saved his life. He had a flashing glimpse of a hairy black horror that swung past him with a clashing of frothing fangs, and something splashed on his bare shoulder that burned like drops of liquid hellfire. Springing back, sword high, he saw the horror strike the floor, wheel and scuttle towards him with appalling speed, a gigantic black spider, such as men only see in nightmare dreams. It was as large as a pig, and its 8 thick, hairy legs drove its ogreish body over the floor at headlong pace. Its 4 evilly gleaming eyes shone with a horrible intelligence, and its fangs dripped venom that Conan knew, from the burning of his shoulder where only a few drops had splashed as the thing had struck and missed, was laden with a swift death. This was the killer that had dropped from its perch in the middle of the ceiling on a strand of its web on the neck of the Nemedian. Fools that they were not to have suspected that the upper chamber would be guarded as well as the lower. These thoughts flashed briefly through Conan's mind as the monster rushed. He leaped high, and it passed beneath him, wheeled, and charged back. This time he evaded its rush with a sideways leap and struck back like a cat. His sword severed one of the hairy legs, and again he barely saved himself as the monstrosity swerved at him, fangs clicking fiendishly. But the creature did not press the pursuit. Turning, it scuttled towards the crystal floor and ran up the wall to the ceiling, where it crouched for an instant, glaring down at him with its fiendish red eyes. Then, without warning, it launched itself through the space, trailing a strand of slimy grayish stuff. Conan stepped back to avoid the hurtling body, then ducked frantically, just in time to escape being snared by the flying web rope. He saw the monster's intent and sprang toward the door, but it was quicker, and a sticky strand cast across the door made him a prisoner. He dared not try to cut it with his sword. He knew the stuff would cling to the blade, and before he could shake it loose, the fiend would be sinking its fangs into his back. Thus began a desperate game. The wits and quickness of the man matched against the fiendish craft and speed of the giant spider. It no longer scuttled across the floor in a direct charge or swung its body through the air at him. It raced about the ceiling and the walls, seeking to snare him in the long loops of sticky gray web strands, which it flung with a devilish accuracy. These strands were thick as ropes, and Conan knew that once they were coiled about him, his desperate strength would not be enough to tear him free before the monster struck. All over the chamber went on that devil's dance, in utter silence except for the quick breathing of the man, the low scuff of his bare feet on the shining floor, the castanet rattle of the monstrosity's fangs. The gray strands lay in coils on the floor. They were looped along the walls, they overlaid the jewel chests and silken couches, and hung in dusty festoons from the jeweled ceiling. Conan's steel-trap quickness of eye and muscle had kept him untouched, though the sticky loops had passed so close that they rasped his naked hide. He knew he could not always avoid them. He not only had to watch the strands swinging from the ceiling, but to keep his eye on the floor, lest he trip in the coils that lay there. Sooner or later, a gummy loop would writhe about him, python-like, and then, wrapped like a cocoon, he would lie at the monster's mercy. The spider raced across the chamber floor, the gray rope waving out behind it. Conan leaped high, clearing a couch. With a quick wheel, the fiend ran up the wall, and the strand, leaping off the floor like a live thing, whipped about the Cimmerian's ankle. He caught himself on his hands as he fell, jerking frantically at the web which held him like a pliant vice, or the coil of a python. The hairy devil was racing down the wall to complete his capture. Stung to frenzy, Conan caught up a jewel chest and hurled it with all his strength. It was a move the monster was not expecting. Full in the midst of the branching black legs, the massive missile struck, smashing against the wall with a muffled, sickening crunch. Blood and greenish slime spattered, and the shattered mass fell with the burst gem chest to the floor. The crushed black body lay among the flaming riot of jewels that spilled over it. The hairy legs moved aimlessly. The dying eyes glittered redly amongst the twinkling gems. Conan glared about, but no other horror appeared, and he set himself to working free of the web. The substance clung tenaciously to his ankle and his hands, but at last he was free, and taking up his sword, he picked his way among the gray coils and loops to the inner door. What horrors lay within he did not know. The Cimmerian's blood was up, and since he had come so far, and overcome so much peril, he was determined to go through to the grim finish of this adventure, whatever that might be. And he felt that the jewel he sought was not among the many so carelessly strewn about the gleaming chamber. Stripping off the loops that fouled the inner door, he found that it, like the other, was not locked. He wondered if the soldiers below were still unaware of his presence. Well, he was high above their heads, and if tales were to be believed, they were used to strange noises in the tower above them, sinister sounds and screams of agony and horror. Yara was on his mind, and he was not altogether comfortable as he opened the golden door. But he saw only a flight of silver steps leading down, dimly lighted by what means he could not ascertain. Down these he went silently, gripping his sword. He heard no sound, and came presently to an ivory door, set with bloodstones. He listened, but no sound came from within. Only thin wisps of smoke drifted lazily from beneath the door, bearing a curious, exotic odor unfamiliar to the Cimmerian. Below him, the silver stair wound down to vanish in the dimness, and up that shadowy well no sound floated. He had an eerie feeling that he was alone in a tower occupied only by ghosts and phantoms.